Hello everyone, today we talk about the Scandinavian origins of the Longobards. I will not discuss in this video the migration from Scandinavian to Scoringen, so all the story that I intend to treat in detail in another episode. But I will refer specifically to the theoretical and methodological question posed by the Germanic myths of the origins, especially comparing the Longobards with the Goths, right? Because their history is very different, and the comparison and the diachrony allows to point out essentially what we mean by these political identities, whether we know or not, or we can theorize or not that they were made specifically in Scandinavia or at some other later, right? Compared to at least what these chronologies would tell us in the continent, Central Europe mostly. And there is all an issue here because at least in a pop context like YouTube, and I get it from the comments on the Germanic history videos that people just watch the most for obvious, and I can say unfortunate reasons just per se, but you know that I make a lot of Germanic history, so I'm not complaining about the fact that these videos are appreciated per se, but the fact that I often see people stopping literally to that. I mean, to the fact that if I make a video like this, I'm sure to receive, several hundred views in a few days, whereas I talk about something much more, complex, actually important, better documented, whatever, from, say, the late Middle Ages. People do not care because they somehow, in part, stop to the simplest concepts. On the other hand, they presume that this is basically the only, for some sort of ethno-identitaristic reason, the only thing that matters to be known, missing the entire point of what we do in history, which is the criticism of the sources, right? I got kids saying, I don't know, but Jordanus said that the Goths came from Scandinavia, so they came from Scandinavia. I mean, we still have, these are not just kids, right? These are actually adult people, right, that literally come up with statements like these, so pretending essentially that reality, this is not just about history, but actually having nothing to do with any form of complex intellective development or capacity or, actual knowledge of the amount of information that we actually have beyond, say, what Jordanus says that was done in a very specific context. So, also that I, generally speaking, am favorable to, say, acknowledge the likely origin of most of these groups from Scandinavia. If anything, their Traditionskern for how it eventually survived, mostly in an elite form, to go, on and to collect other people along the way, let's say, and forming mostly of the Germanic confederacies that we see later. The Longobards are actually one of the, or possibly the closest case to certainty of a Scandinavian origin for a Germanic people. Right, so they lend themselves very well to actually debunk, as we'll see, those theories that have come, especially after World War II, to say that basically there was no such thing like, and in that they were right, at least in the sense of a sort of big, like, single ancestral origin of all these peoples, at least in Scandinavia, right? These topics are important because, over the generations we have come to adopt the Kurganic theory for the origins of the Aryans, essentially the Indo-European people. Just conversely, like I mean, of course, the alt-right is idiot. Then we have the leftistic idiot that says, "Oh, you said Aryan, so you mean it like the Nazis? So you think you're a like?" We are again at these levels of cultural and personal and moral underdevelopment that I believe, given that I'm a traditionalist, that will have the directly mirror like the miserable condition in which all these people, from both the left and the right, live in their constant existence, if we can't call it so. But it's important to speak about these topics because it's really the only way to make things clear for what we care about, right? So there was a time, especially before World War II, and the latter organic theory is actually an important thing because it says that more or less the Indo-Europeans emerged from more or less today's Ukraine, Don River, this area up to the Caucasus, and eventually spread right further. The Kardaware, the Yamnaya culture, especially encompassing this north, as we intended, a bit more in today, in a rational sense, a bit the hub of whiteness, right? So the Baltic, the today's northern Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, etc. Right? So the place from which, and this is also witnessed to some degree, and it's very difficult to make history for such a long time ago. We're talking about millennia before Christ, so it's just like I've gotten sometimes into the the minutiae, if you want, but of the historiographical theories regarding the various movements. There is still an enormous lot to be sorted out, and most of that will not be because we effectively lack the evidence, right? But there is still, of course, also a connection between properly the North, right? That in the mystics of the Aryan peoples that was recollected by the fascists, the Nazis, and so on, was stressing this concept of the Great North, right? The place of eternal light, where everything was perfect and not degenerating and flourishing, but losing the primal purity, virginity. And of course that has to do with the great myth of the North Pole, right? Of the place where, in fact, these peoples would have allegedly originated. Again, if we study the Indo-European mythological traditions, we realize that this broader North could be different things, right? If the Vedas, for example, talk about that, of course, it wouldn't be anything strange of an origin that was just somewhere colder, right, or closer to the sense of the mountain of the Olympus, right, of etc. So I will not digress at all into this. Actually, I want to resume at some point a bit of that traditional history because it's objectively very interesting. Today, we simply stick to what we know about the origins of these peoples that we call specifically as, in this case, the Longobards, the Goths. There is a lot of confusion also in terms of very often people that have a superficial knowledge of this topic treat them all as sort of confederacies, right? The confederacies are something slightly different from what actually the history of the Longobards, for example, was about, right? Because most confederacies were literally the actual confederacy of multiple tribes that had a specific single identity. Of course, even there, we shouldn't force hand too much. There were different clans. Everything was very loose in the boundaries of these definitions. But that, for a while, still stuck to the concept that aside from this international shout-out, such as, I don't know, we call ourselves the Franks or the Alemanni or whatever, we are still the single individual tribes or clans, and fundamentally that's what actually mostly matters to us, which is correct, because these peoples, independently from what, again, the multiculturalistic fiction that you have been fed basically for 70 or 80 years to this point, were actually pretty concerned about their own racial purity in at least a broader sense, right, that encompassed both the spiritual and the physical dimension, because the two things are deeply intertwined and cannot be ever separated from one another. So that's also, we should make a bit of history of racism, because I believe that's often also another topic which is consistently taken just as a sort of a staticistic, narcissistic, flattery, rather than actually understanding what race meant to these people specifically, because this basically had a lot to do, of course, with the actual appearance, but it was connected still with the type of action that they actually took, because they believed in the concept of transcendence and transfiguration, which ipso facto tells that the human condition, which is an inferior one, can be transcended. That it's a problem, right? To live in that sinful condition. This is yet another problem, because there are people who believe that there's all agnostic scam of the negative bias of some religion that tells basically that we're all sinners. Well, that this is what they actually believe themselves. I mean, the entire Norse mythology is based on the concept. Of course, you have to come back to the one, but not through a scam, except the one that you impose on yourself, and the fact that sin must be paid for. That's why the Asgard is to be stormed, because it was the gold that was built with was contaminated by the Nibelungs that alternatively are, and that this is very interesting. Both either the race of heroes of the saga of the Nibelungs and so on, or actually this fallen kind, right, of actually chthonic creatures and so on. And again, what's the difference? It's just a spectrum, right? The same gods are let's say the mankind is essentially the same fallen divinity. So where do you draw the line? Where is satisfactory to be a human, right? Just because you look in a certain way, the mere fact that you're human is the problem, and this is what these peoples actually thought and cared about. We have treated this topic in all sources, starting from the Roman imperial tradition to we've seen it in the Crusades. There's really a lot that we'll encounter in the history of the Longobards people. But what is actually disconcerting and shocking is how much people completely ignore this, even when they pretend to have any kind of traditional knowledge, right? And how they fall constantly in the same identical mistakes that betray the same fallen kind, not just given, of course, that their personal background, but the actual, mental categories. They're typically deterministic, materialistic, structuralistic, and relativistic, and they do not even realize that, and they think to be, some sort of Aryan heroes or whatever. This is a severe problem, and it's really a social disease, right? It's actually a disease too, right? Without social, which also sounds too much structuralistic for my tastes. But starting from facing reality about also what history actually was on the base of a scientific reconstruction is the best way to debunk most of these ideas, and of course being able to discuss these topics that are important when you start approaching them from this point of view. Not again, the aforementioned example, reading Jordanus, believing whatever he writes is the truth, because a person living out, say, in the wake of the full principle of the Indo-European tradition would have possibly killed you just for the actual mental shortcut that you're demonstrating by believing such a thing, right? So the Longobards are fascinating in this regard, because again, they have some of the best preserved ancestral historical tradition, right, that is backed by a consistent set of evidence that we will see throughout the series, but that we can address already today, and that stand out really as a people on their own. I mean, if you pretend to be literate in Germanistics or Indo-Europeistics, you cannot you cannot miss the Longobards, right? You cannot miss them. Even if you want to study, 11th century Iceland, you must study Longobard history. There is no, and not just the origins, right? You have to study the entirety of it. You cannot unknow the Edictum Rotary, for example. You cannot ignore what are the actual, beliefs and organization and identity of these peoples, because they are basically the closest, right, to the level of let's say, the compromise between the ancestrality of it and the level of documentation that you lack basically for any other people in this combination. Right, we do not know that for the Goths as much as we know it for the Longobards in terms of the very origin, the Scandinavian origins. You do not know much history about the actual Scandinavian peoples before they got Christianized or anything. So the Longobards are one of the, if not probably the single most important chain, a ring of the chain in Germanistics. And must be studied extremely careful by anyone who wants at least to claim to know anything about the topic. Now, we have seen the other day I made a video about, say, this sense of political and ethnic compaction of the Longobard people. As I was saying before, the Longobards are not really a confederacy. They are an actual people on their own, right? Not just because their tradition stresses that sense of homogeneity, but because they are a people that surely was the product of some subgroups uniting at some point, and we will see it better in the process of the migration history specifically, and what the myth of the origins actually says about that very thing. But this is a people that, when was met and crushed by Tiberius on the Elbe at the time of the Roman conquest of Germany, was known to the same Romans in the 1st century AD as the Longobards, right? And this ethnonym remains throughout the entire history of the Longobard people, meaning that they never changed it. There was, we do not have any evidence of any sort of reconfiguration of this people, or basically a distraction, secession, re-edition. Admittedly, we know very few, say, what happens to them between, let's say, the assassination of Arminius to the raids together with the Marcomanni in Roman Pannonia until the 6th century. Right, when they re-enter the Roman raider, and we are able to document them satisfactorily. But again, the entire path is pretty linear. As we will see, there are lots of toponyms. We have a pretty solid idea where they passed, right, where they, during their migration, what territories they settled in, where they crossed, and so on. And we have this enormous cultural heritage of actual myth of the origin, supported by other independent sources of the time, such as Fredegarius, for example, that states, just like the Origo Gentis Longobardorum and later Paul the Deacon, that the Longobards did come from Scandinavia, right, from Scandinavia. Again, we see that basically. We will see how the Origo tells us clearly that they crossed the sea from what we think was, in fact, Scandia to today's to the very island of Rügen, telling the truth. So we are in the northeast of Germany. Then they settled in Bardengau and so on. And that's where they met with the Romans. And that early, we already know from the Latin sources that that people was there. That at the time, for the Romans, really meant a name like another, right? They wouldn't suspect that they would come to rule over their own Italy at some point. But it's incredibly clear, together with the unspeakable warlikeness of the same people that is pointed out specifically by the Romans for the Longobards, that this population had an extra gear of some sort based on their absolute traditional identity, right? Of course, still fallen kind, but compared to other Germans, and this is the important thing, really extraordinary in nature, right? There is so much to tell, because what we get also from the medieval literature and so on is that there was a very strong set of legends, basically, about Longobard history, accomplishments. The same Snorri Sturluson treats Alboin as one of the great heroes of the Germanic epos. There is a sense that this was a people that had made it, and it had made it because it had basically not compromise with any form of a patchwork, right? Even in a confederal sense, doesn't mean that it wouldn't absorb new elements, but this was always done on the base of the Longobard people standards, not of some sort of say convenient agglomeration of other groups that would still retain some separated identity within them. There is an incredibly successful formula here that had to do with the standard of the individual, right? The fact that this people was so cohesive because the value of the individuals was higher than the others, right? That's why this is what the Romans noticed, that the Longobards were actually a small people. So it's even more interesting because other confederate groups at some point, at least as they emerged, were very large, right? The Longobards survived as a single people. And so you cannot talk about this kind of grouping of other peoples with another name that re-edited a broader one, if not in the very, very origin of the actual Vodanic adoption that would have occurred in Rügen, right? And we will see again all this in another. So at the very beginning of the journey, this is the point, even before the final settlement in Germany that occurred, in fact, in the Lower Elbe, in a place that is still called Bardengau, right? That eventually was taken over by the Saxons when the Longobards left, but that genetically tells us that, yes, because there are some graves in Italy that are very close to some, display some genetic background very close to the same Saxon one in Britain, right? So there are really lots of interesting insights here to point out, but and all comes together. It flows beautifully, right? With other peoples you do not know, you have to make up conjectures. Here, every single damn thing that we know fits the general pattern that this population simply descended from Scandinavia up to Pannonia, Italy, and maintained this core of beliefs that they basically put at the center of their own political identity, right? And remaining so till the end, and say Longobard traditions continued throughout the Middle Ages in a juridical sense, and unfortunately these are also relatively unappreciated. Let's be honest, completely unknown, right, to the vulgus, informations that instead would alone speak volumes of the success of this population for the reasons that we also see happening over time. Why was, for example, Rother's edict so successful? Right? We have to go step by step. I already made videos about the leges of the Germanic people, so you can maybe start from there, but we will see it better at some point. Right. So this is the starting point. The nucleus of Longobard traditions preserved through many generations the memory and or the faith in a Scandinavian origin of the people, of its people. This again is I made an entire video the other day explaining largely what this is about, how the same pagan background was basically inserted in a Christian Roman context at the time of Rotary. Everybody believed it without any problem. Paul the Deacon is a massive source of all the, say, the anthropological notions, even when he, that he betrays in the moment in which he tries to make up for, right? Not because as a Christian he, was particularly against these beliefs, but because, still formally he had to stick to the, to a sort of providential interpretation of what had happened through the conversion and so on, which is also really relatable if you know just the history of the Longobard kingdom, that, as I always say, is the complete opposite that basically any person that I've ever heard outside of actual scholarship will tell you it really was, which is really unique. I've never met with a topic. It was some concept historically, yes, but the actual diametrically opposite reality, what it actually was, that's rare, right? And it starts even to make you suspicious about, why specifically the Longobards. And I have even there a couple of ideas, but perhaps this is not the best video to talk about. So the Longobard tradition handed out to us the information that the Longobards, initially called Vinli, would have lived at the beginning in this Skåne, right? So it would be Skåne, it would be Skandia, right? So in today's southern Sweden. It makes a lot of sense because it's just in front of Rügen, where we think in this Koringa they actually landed. They met, at least there, with the first enemies, and the Vodanic initiation would take place, so that they would be renamed with this Odinic attribute, right, of the long beard, and so on. We will again pass through all this myths, so don't think I'm skipping this by not saying which. This is told by the Origo Gentis Longobardorum, right? It's told in part also by Polity. I can see you read this. It's all public. There is no mystery. That there are, especially the first one, is a short text, but it's the more poignant for the subject matter of the origins for that, in a didascalic sense. Now, historiographically, as we pointed out, the initial attitude towards this information regarding the Longobards, but also other Germanic peoples, was the one of good faith, like it was believed, right? It was thought to be a very old tradition that these peoples had handed down to us, and that they essentially identify themselves in. However, especially since, I said, after World War II, mostly the age of the contestation, the 70s and so on, there's been, and I don't want to make just the cliche that, it's because of the leftists. Yeah, it's because of the communists who took over the Western academies, because that's what they partition in a sense to as their own sphere of influence. But I've been working myself with some of the greatest experts in Longobard history. With Shirley, she's not a leftist, but she's definitely liberal. I mean, we know to have opposite ideas, and she's an incredibly competent person, of course, beyond what any of this some self-styled, migration era experts you find on the internet all the time think to be. And so I do not simply say, you're an intelligent person just because you're a conservative, right? Or you claim to be one, or claim to be a traditionalist. No, most people are just disgusting, to say the least, by any standard, and that's the first problem we have to cope with. If we truly believe in tradition, because I think it's under everybody's eyes that the standards are radically unsatisfactory by for any political section involved, and there is nothing like, this is just proving to be more than what you are without any proof, where actually the actual proofs that, of course, you do not want to hear tell the exact opposite of it. But again, yes, there is mostly a Marxistic, approach that, of course, in this case was not very structural, must tell you, but that's not the point just entirely. But of course, had to dismiss. It's a sort of, it's an attitude mostly. It's the same attitude of the scientist that tells you, this is all what we know. So, okay, but until we discover something else, there cannot be anything, because that's really what it gets down to, right? And that's not how science, the true science, of course there are scientists who perfectly understand this, but not even history, because the scientific method is really the same, really works, right? Which, of course, doesn't mean either that if you believe in something to exist, and if it doesn't, you have the certainty that it exists anyway. There are lots of paranoid people, again, that I think that the conspiratorial level of, reached nowadays in the masses is directly proportional to the denial of the single most total value of tradition, that is action. That is to say, if you believe truly that there is somebody above you that is running the world, that you are not part of it, it means that you are inferior by traditional value. And so you actually deserve that. So you shouldn't even be complaining about it in the first place. You should just go out there and ruling the world. But of course, also, like 90% of the people who mostly cope with these topics have still problems with conceiving that, tradition is imperial and is Catholic. And it means that you have literally to conquer the world by default, because it's the only way to revert to the one. And so, again, there is the demonization of the Roman Empire because, these were not, according to our post-traditional National Socialistic 19th century invented delirium that, by the way, the Germans themselves didn't recognize the ethnic superiority of Roman power when this was at the peak. And then, so to actually pick the same ethnonym Roman when their emperors began to rule in medieval times. So I will also make a video about this because this goes together all with anti-Christianism. With it's the standard pact that emerged literally from the fourth estate of 19th century National Socialism, right? And National Socialism is always there in the sense that you cannot be a nationalist unless you're a socialist, and vice versa, because the level of categorization requires you forcefully to believe that level of average inferiority to be normal, to ask why need something for it, right? The two ideologies cannot exist one without the other. In fact, they emerge from the split, right, occurred with tradition, which is a bit what happened by degrees in the history of mankind. But again, even pretending people to understand this stuff is a chimera per se, at least in the average that we are, looking at the world now. In any case, that's literally what the Marxists began to do. They began to say, well, since we do not have the explicit scientific formal evidence that, the literal guy that was called with this name of this people crossed, the Baltic from Scandinavia to wherever in Central Europe, we cannot say in absolute terms that these peoples originated from Scandinavia. Now, there are, it's legitimate, right? What is knowing? What is, how do you actually know anything? Right? Do you actually believe that anything exists? I mean, easily, with this point, you could dismiss everything. And, okay, of course, but the way we work with history is also to do something with it, so you can't really sort out things without making mistakes, because otherwise you will just sclerotize into a sort of safe space that, in a leftistic sense, again, sounds clamorously identical to the way that, the alt-right paranoid people think with this ethno-racialistic, suprematistic ideas to just confine themselves at the outskirts of the world, not wanting to know it, denying any imperial power, which is, again, the only traditional value existing here, and not wanting to learn anything. So the point to me here is, of course, that we do not know that. We do not know that even for the Longobards, but here there are like 3,000 arrows pointing at the fact that it was. There is nothing against the actual thing per se. So the question is, we are lucky enough to have somebody from the time telling us that was the case, and all the rest that we can put together is consistent with that. So even if we do not have the actual evidence, why shouldn't we go for it, right? And of course, like, who cares, in the sense that even if they had crossed or not crossed, we know these people cross continuously. It's a non-problem, right? For the gods, for example, it's a bit of a different story, because as we will see now, it's beyond not having the explicit evidence that they crossed from Scandinavia. It's the fact that who we start looking at like the gods are already an incredibly complex, different thing from what we thought we could track even as the product of those who had crossed from, say, a couple of centuries from Scandinavia to wherever we think that the gods at some point were or had been, etc. Right? It's a big deal because I believe, for example, that of course that was an original nucleus that came from Scandinavia themselves. It's a personal belief because it's consistent, after all, with the type of say mechanisms that occurred at the time. One very important thing to bear in mind is that Scandinavia was not particularly warlike like continental Europe, right? Wodanism had been born in Central Europe, not in Scandinavia. It came from the south, right? There is no success or, in this sense, romantic Nordicistic idea in living in places like Northern Europe. Like by far the most powerful peoples lived not just in Mediterranean, but just even if you pick Germany, like that's where the larger, more powerful politically and military compact groups really were. And this is in fact also the history of the Longobards, right, that convert to a degree or are initiated to that kind of militaristic mindset in the moment in which they step into the continent, and not before, because as the sources tell us in the stories, previously they were actually peasants. They were mostly agricultural. Of course, most Germans in Central Europe were the same thing, but still the idea for these peoples is, of course, that you had to have a couple of slaves taken in at least in a raid. You had to just fight and not working to be an actual man, to be an actually superior individual that could eventually be part of a cooler group of superior individuals who could go extending power all around, right? So for the gods, this would seem also evident. So it wouldn't be so strange, however, that some of them came from Scandinavia. The problem again is that link is way more distant from their actual myth of the origin. That is something created very late, when we know that different traditions about the actual origins of the gods existed, and Jordanus just picked the one that was kind of more conventional because it had, again, some mythical ancestral basis a bit all over the world, right? Again, the idea of the hyperboreal sea is there for everyone, so Scandinavia fit, right, the stereotype, but it's not. At that point, it's fiction, right? These peoples, again, specifically may have come from there, and these other peoples around the world may know that, but regarding the specific source, Jordanus and other, and we know that had been modeled from other histories that were developed basically in a Roman reality for essentially making up a sort of especially royal tradition of the people for the gods that were in Italy at the time, that we can be legitimately skeptical about that specific link, especially when it is connected to the sense that these peoples allegedly always had a king, for example, which is notoriously BS because Germany and even more Scandinavia was extremely wary of figures like the one of kings. There were. This is not that there weren't. But again, the idea that there was a large compact people that was the same one that eventually created the Black Sea kingdom in Crimea, and then would basically taken over by the Huns and magically reappeared at some point in the Balkans, and then migrated to Italy. Like, had always had this sort of single. The Amalii dynasty, the chosen, the divine ones, and that this royalty went back to the origins is a bit ridiculous. The Longobards, for example, didn't have such a thing. They would elect some kings at some point, but you realize that the way by which the Gothic accounts were drafted for us to read betray a massive classical ethnographic made up, say also confused, like, or at least inconsistent with other data that we have, picture on the origins of that people. This doesn't eliminate, again, the concept that the original nucleus may have been actually from Scandinavia, but it might have been something, it was likely something way more similar to lots of these other groups that weren't even thinking to be that compact at the beginning, or that didn't even necessarily exist before they actually gathered and were constituted in continental, in Central Europe, rather than with a Scandinavian origin. With the Longobards, it's different, because at least you have some leaders that surely at the time were separated. They were part, likely, of this tribe of the Vinali that had different chiefs, and that eventually consolidated later in a sort of more defined, better defined, more homogeneous group for the sake of the metus hostilis. But interestingly enough, the kings by this point didn't quite exist, and the greatest difference between the Longobards and the Goths is, in fact, this, that the Longobard myth of the origin is a myth of the people, while the Gothic myth of the origin is a myth of kings. Right, and I think it's pretty easy to see how the Visigoths, especially, were essentially created by the Romans as essentially as a regional army in Illyricum, right? How monarchy at that point was literally made up by the Romans for political reasons. They could manage them better, and it was developed further. Alaric is the true first king, as we understand it, of a people that was thinking of itself to be a single chunk, right, of as would later be known as Germanic people. Like, it's not before the 6th century that we find the Germans telling in Latin that they were Germanic, right, and that they recognized at least as such a bit everywhere, because they had been filtered dramatically by through the Roman lens. Right, the Longobards were not so obsessed, for example, with this idea. They were Longobards. That's it, right? Of course, later on, they understood themselves the dichotomy, and they identified as Germans. The speech of Liutprand of Cremona, allegedly in the Antipodesis to the Byzantine emperor, saying that, basically, we, the Germans, the Longobards, the Franks, the Burgundians, whatever, are German, even though this guy was basically Italian and spoke a Romance language, said he thought to be a German because of the Longobard identity, right? And that the Byzantines were essentially a race of corrupts, because the entire background of the fact that Rome had lost, at least the Romans as a people had lost the empire to the Germans. That was their actual belief. Right, not necessarily in Italy. Naturally, people were a bit more, especially at that point, under the Ottonian Empire, involved to that specific case to reject the Byzantine rule in a country where that basically, of course, was the actual center of Romanity, and Romanity that the Byzantines were, by that degree, very distant from, in spite of the legalistic identitarism that some people believe today, that the Byzantines were necessarily just the only emperors because they were the only statual continuators of Rome. That's not how the ancestral Romans believed the Imperium to be. They believed it exactly how they believed it at the time of Charlemagne, or even the same Germans of Tacitus, right? And because the Romans saw that, and that they believed in the same thing, yet still at the time. They were basically, all these peoples had a common origin. Let's remember it quite well. Now, this skepticism, however, that arose, especially for the gods that indeed are the most representative of the Germans during the at least late antiquity, and so are the chunk that is better documented, the one in fact interacted more with the Romans, that rose to the more easily to the stereotype of the barbarian, but also the German civilized by the Roman, right? That this is the concept. Are excessive to the degree again in which, if, right, I've met this attitude around that if you say that, well, yeah, it's possible that the gods had the ethnonym connected to the god, to the same one in Scandinavia, and so these groups may have actually been originated from that. And that will bring to nothing short of an aggression. Here we're not going against any reasonable doubt. We know well the pattern of the early Germanic migrations. They started from the far north, right, from areas that were not just Scandinavia, even though Jutland is attached to the same Germany geographically, but they were pouring from properly the north towards Central Europe, pushing the Celts and actually razing to the ground great part of their center. So just for all those geniuses who come up saying, the Celts were now so desperately fighting against the Romans that they sided with the Germans. The Celts hated German gods. Right, let's put it, very clearly here that the Celts remained for half of a millennium under the Romans, while the Germans were from the other side. If it had been this great desire to just change everything, it would have happened, right? Especially with the incredibly scarce amount of Roman troops that still succeeded in maintaining the frontier that stable for so long. But this is not the actual point. The point being that, again, there is nothing strange in a sort of Scandinavian origin in general. So if your problem is that you live in a place where there are a bunch of racist people who paranoidly obsess about the fact that there is a big scam, and the gods came straight from Sweden since the beginning. They called themselves like that. They had that single identity and simply decided to make a journey to Southern Europe from a primigenial force that had sorted out all before, because that's how things should be. And this world had magically the power to do so, but still remaining underdeveloped for another millennium or more in history. It's your problem as a culture. It's your problem as a country. It's your problem as a people, right? Here, I'm not referring to Sweden specifically, right? This is valid for every country, right? I find it horrifying how there are people like from the entire, I don't know. Okay, let's not point out specific world regions, but this is, yes, a sort of, I don't even know how to qualify this obsession, but surely it doesn't reflect a particular level of civilizational development, and it does spread among the lesser people, right? The marginated people who have problems to cope with reality. Surely it's not merely a matter of some sort of gentrified elite wanted to make you buy some denial of evidence. There may be some of that too, in the measure though, when you start pushing this too far, to the point that you cannot even actually state that there wouldn't be anything strange about a sort of, ethnic core of gods having started as such from Scandinavia, in spite of the fact that, of course, we do not know anything about that. There's not a single even. In other words, it's just imagination. It's fantasy. You want to imagine that? Okay, yeah, it can be more or less plausible. I consider it plausible, for example, but it's still conjecture. And that's how it's destined to remain, because we do not know actually anything about that. And this is also a trick, like a problem, that people say we do not know actually anything. But again, I can read Jordanes saying that, so we actually know that. Again, there is a lot of things between Jordanes saying that and the actual thing having occurred, right? In the sense that there are lots of other things said by lots of other people, and not just the Marxist scholars today. They're, of course, by majority are not Marxist, of course, either. I can testify to some of it, at least. And actually a much greater distance that makes you wonder whether the gods were not instead made as a political reality, because that's what they are, mostly in, of course, Central or even Eastern Europe at some point. And there are lots of elements talking in favor of this. For example, the Gothic language is very ancestral, telling the truth, in its core. This may speak even for that original imprinting, but it's also dramatically more similar to kind of more Central European Germanic dialects than the northern ones. There is a lot of Roman influence, needless to say. There is Celtic influence. There is Greek influence. There is an evidence, of course, that is perfectly consistent with what we know about where these people would have allegedly compacted and moved, and so on. Of course, makes us realize that the mix was severe, especially with Iranian elements, but not only, right? And it's a very different story from the one of the Longobards, for example. So once one, establishes this, everything actually flows much easier. Because, again, we will talk about this in the future. These people normally adopted other elements with the same, not very differently from how the Romans worked their civitas, telling the truth. It was a matter of redemption and of reinitiation. There was a sacrifice and a tribute to blood, mostly in actual terms, like either through the initiatory rites or an actual battle, which was the only place where you could sanction the actual spiritual superiority that could literally transfigure you into a Goth or a Longobard, even if you had another background, right? And naturally you had to stick to standards, to values that were not, again, the one like mostly today people wish that these peoples would have had been, that is to say, some sort of average people living freely and happily, and satisfied, especially with their lifestyle, that were free and pure, and some other dark force from the outside wanted to take them over. This is, again, a paranoid, first of all, a literal feature of paranoid, psychological profile, like to even think this, but secondly is diametrically opposed to what we know these peoples really lived like, what they did, right? And the fact that, of course, we're incredibly warlike and prone to conquer, and expand and take over whatever. I don't know how it can be really consistent with, again, especially the paranoia against the Roman Empire or whatever, unless you must make it a genotypic phenotypic problem, is to say the only reason this would start in 19th century National Socialism is to say the purpose is not conquering the world. The purpose is just saying that I'm better than another guy, and then justifying maybe the same conquest of the world on that basis, but still essentially taking a standard like the one of a lower group of people in the world compared to divine standard, and pretending that that's the only thing that exists and that there can't be a better or or a transcendental dimension that nullifies the fallen meaning of a thing, like, for example, a nation, which is the concept which the same Holy Roman emperors actually understood. That is to say, they called themselves Romans in the actual sources, and Rome was their battle cry. Right, look at, 13th century battles, like look at what the Germans actually shouted before combat. They called themselves Romans. Here's Rome, they said. Right, so the meaning of course, the national exploit existed, but only not in function of a pre-existing condition, but in their actual ecumenic achievement. And by the Middle Ages, the Ghibelline war, but also the Papal one, understood that only Rome had achieved that. So actually this explains a lot, and made really lots of videos about how the Germans entered that world, wanting to partake it, and eventually to take it over. There is no doubt about the latter point, except that when this happened, it was taken over by half. Right, and ever since there's never been a complete Roman Empire. So then this comes together with a broader exhaustion of Eurasia, the same Christianity, which is actually a properly the Catholic traditional religion that all these peoples believed before, but just in a different source that accentuated the sense that the world had been exhausted, and that now there was from one side a more spiritual absolute to be concerned, like it's just like Buddha's protest against the Vedic military that had failed in a sense with its cases to actually re-achieve world domination. And then you have all this series of splits. The Protestant Reformation, the moment in which basically he said that there is nothing you can do as a man to return to God by yourself. It has to just be essentially a passive attitude of yours in front of God's decision, whereas at least Catholicism still is called like this because it actually believes in what the same, Roman Empire, but these peoples believe that is do work, right? So the hero thing there is quite relevant, but I'm digressing. The point, just that so that you know, is that these peoples at the beginning do not, and I think this is perhaps the actual point, manifest, and they were fair about this, an awareness about their own achievement other than within a finite context. In other words, all these peoples knew that was the Roman Empire out there, and they were struggling their own way, because the only way for men is to struggle and win, right? So they would have not known where this would have led them. The Longobards, for example, wouldn't achieve what the Franks achieved historically, as much as the Franks did not achieve what the Romans achieved, etc. But they were, yes, all in theory eligible in this great list, let's say, of accomplishments for that rise to divinity. But until that happened, of course, they couldn't specifically boast that, right? The universal symbols, the eagle, stuff, they were all there. The meaning was always the same. They tried. Right, so that's the only space that actually, and I'm not even sure the concept of nationality has to do with that. Of course, you can approximate that a group, like in this case the Longobards, were approximating themselves in a way that was still etymologically different from the term, from the term national, right? From the term nazio, that in this sense already distinguished them from a place where they had been born, because they were somehow semi-nomadic, and even though they maintained this Scandinavian origin, and they eventually shared it with other people. And if you call yourself a Longobard or a Goth or a Frank, whatever, you still are, in that sense, saying that eventually that is not enough, that there is something less, but you put yourself to something less. You do not remember the, say, Scandinavia because it's the exact entire place where you come from. You just came from someplace, and so to Scandinavia you're attaching just the memory of the fact that you historically came from there, plus all what the classical ethnographic stereotypes said about Scandinavia again. But in fact all these written traditions eventually and oral traditions that from which surely these ones of the Longobards especially came from were already approximated to a fallen world that these peoples were aware of, right? So the totalizing ambition behind these populations is actually mild. They knew they lived somehow at the outskirts of the world, and they still thought they had to prove themselves. One could wonder what the awareness of divinity turning into Longobards, say in the 2nd and 1st century BC, was of the entirety of the space out there. It was a broader folk which they were aware of the world, but not necessarily aware of the scale of the world's accomplishments. How much did these people know about Alexander, for example? Well, surely they knew something about it. There is no doubt. The problem that will never be answered is how did they pose themselves in front of such a thing? And how, even if they had done, how did they cope with the fact that had come evidently first in a hierarchic value of accomplishment to what they did? Right, so the sense that somebody could still save the world was still there. And these peoples weren't subtracting them as long as they were free, right, to that possibility. But it's also, it all starts from within the heart of man, right? It doesn't start just from, in fact, which group you belong to, right? Because these groups can be molded, remolded, erased, created. This is a bit what Rome, like everybody did right here. How many non-Germans were, simply taken from the Goths, and what was the reason of that? The reason was that they chose the noble ones. That's what Aryan actually means. It literally means noble. Doesn't mean, of course, there is a deeper semantic to it. We can't reduce it just to our contemporary term, but it had to do essentially with a sort of spiritual race, as opposed to necessarily were on this piece of dirt that is literally created by the sin of man, the original sin, so the incarnation of the celestial bolt, and so this accident that you created as a disaster, right, it really values. That's how they thought of it. And that's why I'm personally impressed with the incredibly poor rendition that even movies that want to talk about, for example, the Norse, that admittedly were living already in a more fallen world than these ones, because the world ages and there's nothing to do about that, unfortunately. Everybody knows that in these religions. But like how superficially this concept is treated per se. Right, we find, I don't know, that there have been movies like The Northman with Valkyrie bringing, the concept of a woman being brought into the Valhalla. Are you freaking kidding me? Right, I'm talking about not the Valkyrie. I'm talking, which is in fact, it's not an actual. It's the female's principle of the fury. It has to be tamed, and possessed, and transfigured as the same soul of the warrior. Why don't you show that in a movie? You only show BS. You want to make scenes where there are dual Fednars that do same kind of incredible tactical things against any logic, and as opposed to actually providing with the literal meaning of what these peoples lived in that we actually know if you just spend a part of your life at least studying. So the point, what can we add to the plausibility of the Scandinavian origins of the Longobards? Of course, a lot that we will see in the series. As we were saying, the Longobards have a bit like the primate of this unspoiled origin, the fact that, especially as a single people, they formed just after that and they survived till the end of their history as such, which is really rare among the Germanic peoples in the first place. There are naturally striking analogies between the Longobard law and the one of the populations of ancient Scandinavia. We know it very well. The way the women were, for example, regarded, like, that has of course nothing to do with this other strange feministic branch that National Socialism has taken, as if, in Scandinavia women were actually ever free in a juridical sense, which is, for anybody who has the fundamental notions of Germanistics, a very curious idea, right? And of course, the disgusting thing is that they're doing this just because they think that so that they can, that they're already fitting the box that the left has created for them, right? They think, as people, that it was actually a very negative thing that the woman had that specific role in tradition. So they have to make up, essentially, a feministic, Marxistic, deterministic, relativistic, materialistic ideology, anti-spiritual ideology, anti-traditional ideology, to pretend that Scandinavia was a sort of feministic heaven, or at least, one where people were equal. Admittedly, not all National Socialists do this, but there is a lot of them. And of course, this emerged mostly from the Fourth Estate, for people that have lost any actual notion of the traditional spirituality of man and woman. Just so that you know that gender is not a word, right? There is just man and woman. There is not male or female. There is not gender. There is just man and woman and their sex. There is nothing else, right? This is tradition, right? It's not a matter of personal opinion. However, striking are also the common characteristics of Longobard mythology and the one of the ancient peoples of the north. There are some beautiful references to we will see it when we talk about the Fatules, some insults that the Longobards made to the Gepids, the other way around actually, because, by the way, the Gepids had just been crushed by the Longobards and they were a bit posteriorly hurt by the event. And there are some insults that recur just in the Norse sagas beautifully. But it's, again, we will study properly the Longobard myth per se and observe the fundamental notions of Indo-European identity. I mean, there was a godfather and then some children, or at least the son in a broader sense. Now there were multiple because of the aforementioned reason of the Longobards divinely emerging from different leaders that were crossing the Baltic Sea. But there is the mother Gambara that represents the angelic woman, the same one that the Templars loved in their transcendental, like, traditional sense. I mean, in chivalry and so on. So this fury that had to be beaten in combat, that appeared at the moment of death, or the risk of dying, and that was the supreme test in which you had to not to be terrified by the most terrifying image of the fury, and you had to essentially possess this woman so that you could transfigure her in your own soul, coming back to going to heaven, or at least to a degree, if you weren't enough, that The Valhalla, for example, is a let's say is a concept of, right? You're not fully saved in Valhalla. It's not heaven. Like, okay, we made it in Valhalla. It's actually, as you know, just by the myth, a place where you're training for the end time, right? Where for the age of the wolf, where you do not know whether all the Valhalla warriors are going to be enough to defeat the forces of the darkness, right? So it's actually an eschatological behavior, belief. I mean, and it has hardly to do also with Gnostic cyclicity. That's for the Pelasgians, for the non-Indo-European peoples, as a matter of fact, and not even entirely, for that matter. I don't remember what I was saying, but there is striking correspondence between the figures of the Ulfadnars and, of course, of the hound men Longobards. Let's put it in this way, which is, to be fair, not necessarily a proof of Scandinavian connection. My surname, for example, derives from bear, and it has Frankish origins. Surely they were connected with Scandinavia, because there you find lots of more bears than else, right? The Longobards here were more like the wolf. That is a symbol that you find in the steppes far and wide. We've seen the Draco, the migration era military standard that existed actually way before that, since, in fact, when the Indo-Europeans were all in their proto state, in the same cauldron. It's the same wolf of Rome, actually, and it's all these peoples originally had the Ulfadnars on the roll. We know it pretty well in their military history, in their heroic phase, both archaeologically and documentarily. But definitely by the time of Paul the Deacon, and even some of the ones, in fact, the Common Era prior to that, of course, the Norse, let's say the North Germans and other populations were more likely to still have that actually very primitive way of going at war, to different degrees. There were entire peoples at a time that would turn into these warrior beasts. The Lugi, for example, as they're described by Tacitus doing that, whereas in other cases were just some sort of outcasts, or people that were chosen for that specific purpose and lived their transfigurational experience of the comitatus outside of the Zippe, but hopefully at a point through their conquest to establish some Zippe on their own. And so it's this concept of the eternal generation, right? So the fact that Scandinavia was pouring out peoples in this continuous dynamic that seemingly had to do with, also in the case of the Longobards, by the way, as many others, with some environmental imbalances, because the land was naturally very difficult to live in. So at every minimal change, it was more likely that greater amount of people had to leave, because there wasn't enough resources to sustain anyone. And so given a bit this impression. But as you know, it was an ethnographic trope of the classical times. And there were other places from, for example, the Central Asia, where this kind of waves would keep arriving. So you can find different parallelisms. There are Scandinavian connections of the Longobards, definitely in the, say, noble nomenclature of, for example, the Gauzi, the Harodi. These were Longobard dynasties from which the great kings Alboin and Rotary would descend. And they are names that refer to Norse people. Even more important is the fact that still in the 6th century. This admittedly according to Jordanus. So everything is to be, again, conceived in a not completely certain way, but all these data together mean something. There was, in fact, a Scandinavian people with the name of Vinuvilot that would linguistically correspond easily to the Vinili, which is a bit what happened also further south with the Bardengau, right? The idea is that when these peoples moved, naturally some of them remained home, and so it would be normal to find this. It's like with the gods, right? And so because Jordanus makes the case that these peoples had been originating from Scandinavian, he finds also the consonants, where the connection, the name connection of the original ones still living in Scandinavia. So this is also perfectly plausible. Just we have Jordanus even pointing it out, because the Vinili do not recur like a particularly important people in this case. However, you know that from the Longobard myth of the origin that tells you that they switched from Vinili to Longobards. And so basically the Longobard tradition had a memory of something that happened before even the 1st century AD. So it's that old, and they still hand it down. And so you see how independent sources actually have considered at the time of Jordanus, the Longobards were yet to arrive to Italy to start writing whatever. So the correspondence is striking, right? That this people was remembered with the actual name that the same Longobards remembered as having originated from. By the way, Vinili comes from Vinnan, which means winning, and so Paul the Deacon, again in his providential interpretation, doesn't. He hints actually at a broader meaning this would have had, but it was let's say there is a normalization in showing a bit the Vinili as a peaceful people that eventually turns into Volunism, while the original etymology suggests that this Vinnan was a sort of omen that would have brought the Longobards to eventually be recognized by Odin as their his adoptive sons and daughters, as we will see from the origin, which is also extremely fascinating in the fact that the same Longobard women to show to be mourned, hoping that numerically, like in front of Volden, they brought their hair in front of their cheeks and their chins, so to act as men, right? To act as if they were warriors, right? And so it's really a people's myth. But at this point, the Vinland character of the Vinili, in fact, would have been recognized by Volden's encouragement before the battle, and that would make the Longobards, in that sense, that of course win with Volden's favor, which is beautiful, of course. We also have to observe, which may seem banal, but it's really not, that the same Skadanan, so the Skånen, the Scania, remains, right? And also the emigration from the same land, integrating part of the religious tradition of the Longobard people, is recorded in a pre-Christian phase, as, of course, the Origo refers to a pagan past, and again, as we were saying before, it's interestingly inserted in the official documents of the Longobards when they were a Christian power, so, which is extraordinary to think about that, because again, there is no reversal to paganism. They were simply saying, this is who we are, right? So we identify so much with this story that we must pass it down, like in every, say, context that basically affirms our own identity. And this reference to Scania is, again, before, it was there in a pre-Christian phase. It was evidently not added or therefore or evidently self-evidently removed when the oral tradition was reformulated in letter, right, written down. So this is yet another favorable hint of the Scandinavian origin of the Longobards. But there is really, really more, right? Just the same, we will see it in the videos about the migration, the actual steps, right? The Longobards took, the chronology, the fact that the Romans met them where they were settled, the proximity to Scandinavia, is all consistent, right? And we base ourselves, and so just think how important these sources were, on the Origo, right? Just think about all, because the understanding is that the Germans had all their own beliefs in the same regard. They knew in theory where their clan, their tribe had originated from, right? The point being, though, that by the time most of these people were Christianized, this process of acculturation would pass essentially skipping the sense of their own origin. And part of the reason of this is probably, in my opinion, that the nobility, just per se, first of all, it's a problem of documentation, right? There is no doubt about that. But the time in which this happened historically, we're talking about the early Middle Ages, sometimes the High Middle Ages, is a moment in which the people had lost their power. Just the elites ruled. And not because of the process of Christianization, but as a cause of that, meaning that, in Central Europe, Northern Europe, the commoner lost great part of its liberty, notoriously at that time. So that sense of compaction, of popular strength, we have seen how strong this was among the Longobards, instead was immediately written down in the moment in which the Longobards came straight in the 6th century from Central Europe, and from a background that still was pretty, fit in that sense of social balancement. We know it from the Longobard graves in Pannonia, etc., that they had a very strong middle class, we can say. They, differently from the Gepids, from the Goths, right, that had already a much more stratified society, and that, surprise, surprise, were developing a myth of their own royalty. Something unknown back then. And at best, a Germanic rex in the Latin sense was the elected military leader at a given point by a Germanic group to wage war. So in a moment of crisis, after which the situation was normalized with all the various communities living more, let's say, without this overlordship, right? This was an obvious need in times of war, because you cannot have a civilization without strategy, unity of command, whatever. So that's how they made it work, even in their condition. And only gradually, and especially with the Romanization, the oligarchies were further co-opted in a sort of monarchic sense by the empire, and again with all the myths on the gods written by Cassiodorus, by other authors, that basically made them believe that there were these kings that originated from that their dynasty originated from Scandinavia, and that there was all a line with that. We realize it's made up, right? Aside from the fact that it's full of inconsistencies, but in general, we know that that's not how it worked originally, right? The Longobards, interestingly enough, in fact, did not have this. They did remember their kings, at least at the moment in which they wrote down the stories, because they already had kings by that point, when the political and territorial needs of ruling facto kingdom in Italy emerged, right? But they had an intermittent history. Seemingly the Huns, at a point, co-opted some monarch. That is to say, put some Longobard noble at the hand of the people. But then when the Huns fall, the Longobards revert to their non-monarchic situation. Even Alboin, etc., was not technically like the king of the people, as if there was a monarchic institute. It was just a very capable leader that by now was needed, because already by the 6th century, these peoples, even outside of the Roman Empire, were first of all in contact with it, and of course helped to develop such greater authority, etc. But it was, let's say, the Longobard monarchy is something that is fully established only in Italy. By the same Longobards, by the way, without any blessing by anyone, not by the Franks that got the imperial vicary of the Gauls, or things like by Constantinople. All this time, this is what again was very praised by all the other Germanic peoples, including the same Franks and others that had compromised with Rome in a sense, because the Longobards were walking in the wake of the most traditional attitude and behavior that by that point seemed like a lost traditionally. And in fact, the broader destiny of these peoples was, the Longobards were the last great migration. The peoples of Germany were conquered by the Franks, that were already essentially a Gallo-Roman empire. The peoples in Scandinavia wouldn't really develop much of a, political power until very late in time. Talking about the level of kingdoms or even more empires, like in the Merovingian case. So the Longobards were a sort of miracle, right? In the way they remained what they were for such a consistent amount of time, and especially in the accomplishment of settling in Italy herself, which, where another all the others, even the Ostrogoths, had ultimately failed, at least to maintain as a condition. Now, the Origo tells us really three things that have to do with the Scandinavian origin. Again, in the region of Scandinavia, the members of this people still called themselves Vinili, a name that again likely means fighters, winners too, from Vinland. The Vinili led, according to the tradition of their descendants, a peasant life, or at least agricultural life, and this can be drawn from the fact that presumably they also migrated from Scandinavia for lack of workable land. The last point is that they apparently didn't know yet the institution of monarchy, but were under the guidance of principes. That is the aspect which we'll start next time when talking about the actual migration from Scandinavia, right? So naturally, I digressed here and there as always, but I think we dealt with some of the most important aspects here, because especially the comparison with the gods. You understand why it's important, right? Because we didn't descend in very much detail about the gods, but really there is plenty. We could make another video for that matter. By the way, there is another issue that has been pointed out. There were some scholars that were wrong in many ways. For example, Mommsen back in the day that thought that even the Longobard history was like made up. Right? You will find occasionally some scholar that, in this sense, without any evidence and not even any comparable one, right? This is also a bit of a difference in method. We'll tell you, well, we cannot simply rely on this traditions. The question is why. Again, this video was to point out why we actually think that there is nothing strange about specifically the Longobards having started from Scandinavia, right? And the point being, again, the usual skepticism that is not healthy skepsis, but literally saying, okay, well, just pretend that this stuff is not true because maybe they made up. Proof of this, right? When you have actually the only evidence available finding so many points in favor of the same concept, nobody knows. In fact, generally speaking, especially about the Longobards, because the Longobards again are the ones that even historiographically you can't really say much against, right? They're a bit like the pain behind to all the anti-Scandinavian Genesis kind of theory, because by themselves prove that, of course, there is much more if you dig really in. Like also, again, throughout the late Middle Ages, you find some sources in places like Germany and tell the story of this Longobard that, by the way, had become famous because, again, the Edictum Rotor was known, the Paul the Deacon was read, right? Generally speaking, Europe was starting to make history also in a more advanced fashion towards the Renaissance and so on. The point that was brought is that the Ostrogoths may have influenced the Longobards in developing their own theory. So given that also the Ostrogoths were, as we've seen, give us the impression that the Ostrogoths give us the impression that their, of course, myth of the origin is made up because the figure of the king is just anachronistic in so many of these contexts, and especially the possibility of tracing the origins, everything that had happened to the Goths that had at some point they're really overrun by the Huns. I was talking about the Ostrogoths, those who would become the Ostrogoths, so-called, by the way. They were just called Goths, right? The contemporary terminology comes from the fact that the true Goths were in Italy when the coin term Visigoths for the Spanish ones was created. So just later we said, okay, since they were the Visigoths, it's called the Ostrogoths as well. But at the time they wouldn't, because these were the gods of Ravenna, the gods of Rome. It's an entirely different history. But somebody pointed out that it was the Goths who influenced the Longobards that would eventually settle in the same Italy to make up this theory of their own origins. Well, this is a very idiotic point because, again, the two traditions are completely different. Aside from what goes in favor of the actual Scandinavian origin of the Longobards, but especially at the time of the Longobard conquest of Italy, the Goths were essentially an inconsistent people. Yes, there were some groups here and there, some garrisons scattered that opened the gates to the Longobards, like basically anyone involved, also because probably it was really all prepared with the Byzantines, right? And the thing just got out of hand. But it's unlikely that the Longobards simply moved into Italy without any imperial, not necessarily prompt, because they would have done it anyway, likely at that point, but still without an imperial preparation of some sort. In fact, no army intervenes, nothing happens. The entire myth of the siege of Pavia is actually made up. That is made up because in that case they did want to copy the Ostrogoths with the siege of Ravenna against Odoacer, but there is no evidence of the siege of Pavia having actually occurred. On the contrary, it seems that everything is so swift, we do not find destruction. There is no trauma at the moment of the Longobard invasion in the Po Valley. Just in the south, when they basically began to raid the Byzantines that resisted, but that's another story, right? When they settled, they of course didn't destroy. They weren't stupid, like in case you didn't notice. But aside from this, the Goths couldn't, at that point, they didn't have the ethnic consistency of influencing the largest migration era group into these beliefs that are so evidently rooted from a much longer and older time than just the one in which they met with the gods, right? So it doesn't make any sense. Fredegarius, that also writes an Origo, says that the Longobards came from what he says Scandinavia, Scathanavia. So this whole thing is just a bit. Other analogies with the Nordic thing, the origins. Well, Vinil and Vandil, as Snorri Sturluson talks about, and this would be the Vinili and the Vandals. So the divine twins, protectors of migration, children of the god of the sky, right? Plus the female figure that is the one that, as we've seen, you have to tame in order to transfigure coming back to God, but the divine origin of the Vinili and the Vandals, the latter appearing in the moment in which the Vinili actually become Longobards because they fight against the Vandals that had blocked their path, and they call Odin and crush them. And the Vandals too likely were around. About that people also we can make some considerations about their Scandinavian origins, but not in this video. So as you understand, the Longobards really fit all the kind of possible context, evidence, just knowledge, theory that we can draw about their migration. There are people that surely coalesced in the moment in which they were essentially settling in Germany, after having migrated from Scandinavia. Again, we do not have the scientific explicit evidence of this having been real, but every single indicator tells us that it's plausible and that there is nothing against it. For the gods, I again am convinced that their original regroup may have objectively had to do similarly with the Vinili/Longobards, with a Scandinavian group that had arrived somewhere, and that had, or different groups for that matter, because as you know also from Jordanes in Scandinavia there are different gods. I made a video about the Geats just recently for later times to point this thing out. And that surely were coalescing somewhere else, right? Surely further south in Central Europe, likely, and eventually going east on the Black Sea, in Crimea, and so on. And becoming, think about the Tervingi, the Greutungi, so those are also massive groups that are evidently mixed heavily with other ones that they got like a ravine along the way. The Tervingian, or some of them, are the ones of Adrianople. At Adrianople there were also Ostrogothic cavalrymen for that matter. And then they enter the empire. They're the first ones that are properly regimented by the Romans as a Roman army, and eventually settled in Aquitaine, from there also in Spain. The Greutungi are taken over instead by the Huns. We do not know exactly what happens to them. For a while they are under them, they fight for them. There is surely a strong Gothic, like in Greutungian, let's call it better, element among the Huns that have a high opinion of these guys, also because they're surely an Irano-Germanic people by that point. They have married into the local Iranians, the Sarmatians that were there in Ukraine before this group arrived. This dynamic, by the way, is dramatically similar to the one of the Varangians, and even for that you can make the case that objectively, yes, the bulk was not even Germanic. These leaders, this war bands, these mercenaries, were Germanic, but the majority of people there was Iranian. Albeit you can admit that the Iranians were a bit nomadic still at that point in that area, so that the Germans came as a sort of instead still fundamentally sedentary people. Like, we call them semi-nomadic because they moved over the generations, but they lived as, even though they had powerful cavalry and all, as actual sedentaries. I don't underestimate the nomadic influence even in some kind of lifestyle. Even the Longobards, when they arrived from Pannonia, like the first generations, they buried themselves with the horses. They looked like a damn steppe people. But we know from their social segmentation, from the weapons, whatever, that they still were largely infantry, of course, and like any other Germanic people for that matter. And they look pretty Germanic in everything. We know also the origin of the Germanic, say of the Longobard language. There were Elb Germans, so this is also another complicated topic. But the Longobards settled in the Lower Elbe, and at that point were part of the Swabian Confederacy. That at a certain point breaks in the 2nd century AD, and so lots of peoples, including the Alemanni, what would become the Alemanni, there are a consistent amount that eventually renamed themselves in the age of the confederacies, but they were all Elb Germans, right? So the Bavarians, the Suebi that moved to Portugal and so on, and that's a bit of another story. But you see, even just spatially, how the gods belonged somewhere else. And surely there were lots of people that had nothing to do with the Scandinavian origin among them. About the Longobards is a bit more complicated to tell, because surely also their majority wasn't necessarily native from Scandinavia. I mean, even the same Germans weren't all, like the majority had just historically, even of the Scandinavians, had come from the mainland, from Central Europe. But they were consistently Germanic. About the gods, you start having doubts, right, about the majority. The Longobards surely get a lot of Iranians among them. They have Huns. All these peoples have lots of different groups among them, but they're assimilated. And their sense of themselves. This is true also for the gods, right? This is not to say that the gods were actually pretty compact themselves. Their oligarchies, especially, had developed surely the sense of being, say, part of a shared past of some sort. The West Germans, or at least the ones that simply turned from various tribes that we know the name of into the Alemanni, the Franks, have a different history, right? The eastern you go, the more military compact you become. And you can also be taken over by other peoples, which can significantly damage you and also oblige you to collect lots of others in a very clumsy way. I mean, the Ostrogoth, especially after they moved, say, between they shook off the Hunnic yoke from themselves, and they migrated into Italy, were a pretty messy thing, right? So you can't really and simply speak of them as, okay, well, that's the same group, like this guy's from Scandinavia. Yeah, that's what they were, true-born Swedes, or not born, like, they were kind of were that, right? It's that group. No, that's not how it works. The Longobards, at least, were born in the time in which they had a consistent Scandinavian background. Yes, in that sense, yes. But even then, they gathered lots of people still from Central Europe, including surely other peoples, by the way, that had come in turn from Scandinavia. Consider that. When they crushed other peoples, and if this had come from Scandinavia, yet of course there is a consistent chance that they still had a more solid Scandinavian origin altogether. With the Goths, it's much more complicated, because there were lots of other peoples where they dwelled that weren't Scandinavian, and they had never been. So that's the actual difference. And the myth of the origin is completely different. The Longobards are people. The Ostrogoths are a dynasty. At least, maybe not quite in the sense that as a people entirely were, but they were ruled by groups that saw the Gothic history as dynastic, at least by the 6th century, where the Romans basically created it for them as they had asked it to be, right? This is the ABC of it, really. You understand naturally that these topics are much more complex, but they do boil down to this in practice. So there is no shady trick behind it, and this is basically the point we see here. Now, for today, I stop it here. We will keep talking about the Longobards, hopefully soon. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.